I'm a bit overcome by Robin's generosity and a bit dismayed at his inability to tell the time properly. But there we are. I haven't got any slides this evening because, metaphorically speaking, I want you to look at a picture, and we're going to come to a picture in a minute. Just very briefly, to pick up where we left off last time, we were thinking of the second pronouncement of blessing which Jesus made in the Discourse on the Mount, and is contained in Matthew chapter 5 verse 4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Happy are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And I hope by now you've observed the method which we are attempting with these blessings. It's not to impose an interpretation upon them, but to try and use other parts of the Bible to illustrate them, and therefore to allow the Bible itself to interpret these principles which Jesus speaks. And with that blessing, or concerning those who mourn and who will be comforted, last week we tried to illustrate it with the life of David. You know, we've gone back several times to the history of David, and last time we went back to what was probably the lowest point in his life, after he had been guilty of serious wrongdoing, and by his own admission, for some time remained silenced about it and in denial. And then the words of God through the prophet Nathan helped David to see the horror of what he had actually done. And then at once David made his confession. I have sinned against the Lord. And we see David heartbroken and mourning as regards his unworthiness before God. And if you recall, we looked at Psalm 32 and then Psalm 51, which was David's prayer for forgiveness and David's plea for cleansing. And we recall the words of Nathan, that as soon as David said, I have sinned, the prophet said, and the Lord has forgiven thy sin. And then we see the happiness. We saw briefly the happiness that came to David on account of this, where he said in that psalm, blessed, happy is the man whose transgression is forgiven and whose sin is covered. And we saw that other than confess, David could do nothing himself to recover his relationship with God. He was a recipient of God's mercy and God's grace. And the only amendment David could make was to henceforward reorder his life according to the word of God and not in rebellion to the word of God. So the main focus last week was on this mourning of David. What I want to think about more this week is the other side of it, the comfort that comes to those who are forgiven. And to elaborate this, I want to use a New Testament passage to show how the old and the new are perfectly harmonious in the message they give. And what I want to do is to look at a passage of the teaching of Jesus. Jesus taught us about God. Jesus revealed to men and women the character of God. And when we look carefully at the teaching of Jesus, we see that there is no conflict whatsoever between what Jesus says and what God says. So in this passage, which Jesus speaks to us, he is giving us a picture of God. He is showing us what God is like. And in particular, Jesus is showing us how God is a father. And it comes in a parable, a very famous parable. It's recorded only in Luke's Gospel and in the 15th chapter. So if you can turn to Luke 15, no page numbers, I'm sure you're there straight away. Luke chapter 15. Now, there are 3 parables in all in this chapter, essentially about lost things. The idea is that which is lost. And it's well worth noting why it was that Jesus spoke these parables in the first place. And it was because the Pharisees were murmuring against him. They were complaining that Jesus received sinners. He consorted with sinners. He fraternized with sinners. And to the Pharisees, well, that was totally and completely unacceptable. And in particular, I want us to focus on the third of these parables. Now, you've all heard of it, I'm sure, the parable of the prodigal son. Have you all heard of that? I'm sure you have. Right, here's a question then. What does the word prodigal mean? We use it today in English. Who knows what the word prodigal means?
Wayward?
No.
Religious.
No. It means actually wasteful, extravagant, reckless, profligate. That's what it means. But I get distracted by words. That is the secondary meaning today, and that has become the usual meaning. To waste things, to be completely extravagant. The original meaning, if you go back to the Latin root of it, because it comes from a Latin word, which means to drive forth. But curiously, we shall see that the son in this parable is not driven forth. So we'll come to it in a moment. I just wanted to clear that point about the word prodigal. And incidentally, the younger son in this parable, who is popularly referred to as the prodigal son, is never referred to in that way in the parable. He is only ever spoken of as the younger son of his father. So we should be careful when we're reading it. That's how he comes out in the narrative. Now, let's have a look at it. The parable begins in verse 11. And from verse 11 to verse 13, we see that this younger son has a quest. It's a quest for, shall we say, independence. Verse 11. And Jesus said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And the father divided unto them his living. So here is the youngest son. And it seems that he feels a sense of restraint in his father's house. And he wants to have a taste of freedom and independence. He wants to live himself. He wants to be his own master. So what does he do? He said, verse 13, not many days after, so his father has given him his goods, not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country. So he separates himself from his father and his father's household, and it seems that he has been lured by what the world has to offer. As people say sometimes, he wants to see life. That's what he wants to do. And he goes to the far country. Why is that? Well, out of sight, out of mind. And the far country, well, it's easily reached. Now, what do we have here? If we think of the father and his younger son as representing God and man, God and humanity. And so what we're going to have here is a revelation of what man's separation from God entails and what it means. So we keep that in the back of our heads. So what does he do when he gets to the far country? The end of verse 13. There he wasted his substance with riotous living. And that perhaps is where the phrase prodigal son comes from. He wasted his substance with reckless or riotous living. He's turned his back on his father, just as man turns his back on God and goes his own way. But he's on a downward course. He squanders what he's been given without saving anything, the gifts his father had given him, and in the end he reaches the depths. He comes to the point of extremity, which for a Jew was something of utter degradation. Verse 14. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. Now, for a Jew, it doesn't get worse than that. These unclean pigs, and he was feeding them. Verse 16, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. You see, the far country had nothing to give. Oh, I'm sure all was well when he was spending his father's substance, but when it's all gone, the far country has nothing to give to him. No pity, no sympathy, no help. You see, the law of the far country was survival of the fittest, with all its heartlessness as well. And then we come to the third part, which I'm going to call a returning reason. Verse 17. And when he came to himself. That's striking, isn't it? He came to himself. It suggests that for a while he had been beside himself. You know, there was one occasion where Jesus was so busy teaching, he was in Capernaum, that his mother and his family were so worried about him, they said, he's beside himself. And they went to get him to bring him home, because they thought he'd lost his mind. And here we have this similar situation. He'd been beside himself, but now he came to himself. He sees reason in his terrible circumstances. He had been living in a way that was thoughtless of his father and his father's home. But now his outlook changes. And what does he say? When he came to himself, he said, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee." Hired servants. And you know, the hired servants were the lowest form of servants. In the East, there were slaves who were born in the house, but they had a closer relationship with the family than the hired servants. And so he says, they've got plenty to eat in my father's house. They're not hungry or destitute. And he's come to see that it's better to serve in his father's house than to reign in the far country. What he thought was freedom has become slavery. And he says, I'll go to my father and I'll say, make me as one of thy hired servants. Take my life and let me serve. But he's done a difficult thing, hasn't he? He says, I'll say I have sinned against heaven and before thee. That's a hard thing to say. It's not easy for anyone to admit it. Well, we saw that with David, didn't we? That period of silence. He didn't want to admit it. But then he saw it. And so here. He becomes conscious of his wrongdoing and the sense of unworthiness, just like David had. So he says, I'll go to my father. Now, we're not told, are we, what the motive was, why he should go to his father. He doesn't say, well, I love my father, so I'll go to him. What it seems is, he's hungry, and he wants to go to his father's house to be fed and for its security. But we're not going to say anything more about his motive. Maybe that's what it was. And now we come to the fourth part of it, from verse 20. And we see the rebellious son acknowledging he's done wrong and returning to his father's house. Look at verse 20. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. What an extraordinary welcome home that is. But what does it tell us about this father? That he was watching, that he was waiting, that he never gave up on his boy coming back. And full of compassion, when he sees him in the distance, he runs to greet him. Love goes out to meet him. Remember what we're talking about here? It's God and man. This is Jesus' picture of a God ready to pardon. Some people say, well, fancy a father running like that to greet his son in that condition. What a loss of dignity. Well, no, that's a superficial view of dignity. Sweep that aside, because here is something born of compassion and love. It's a great thing that he does. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But you see, on the part of the Father now, he's gone and he's kissed him and he's welcomed him back. There's been no interrogation, has there? There's been no questioning. There's been no, I told you so, or you've come back, have you? No, there has been a readiness to pardon. There is a forgiveness that has forgotten the past. You know, when we pardon somebody, we're very sort of magnanimous about it, aren't we? Oh yes, okay, I've let you off. Isn't that good of me to do that? But I won't forget that you did that. How different is the Father's action here in this parable? There is a reconciliation based on pardon. And all that the Son had previously rehearsed that he was going to say, he couldn't say it because his Father interrupts him. You know, he's going to say, make me as one of thy hired servants. He doesn't get that far, does he? Because verse 22, the Father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. Make me as one of thy hired servants. Doesn't get it out, does he? And how appropriate that is, because what the Son was thinking was this: let me atone for what I have done by what I will do. Let me serve. Let me wipe out the sin and the shame of years when I wasted your substance and wounded your heart. No, can't be like that. He has said the one thing necessary: I have sinned. And that indicates a humbling of his pride, the experience of shame, the making of confession, just like David. Menial service will not atone. The service of tomorrow will not atone for the sin of yesterday. We cannot, by service, undo anything in the past. And you know, the Father doesn't ask it. That's what's key here. He has made provision in compassion. Atonement comes by what is done for the Son, by the love and the mercy and the grace of his Father. Now then, happy, blessed are they that mourn. Here is forgiveness, full and free. But mark this now. It's not ended there. The forgiveness is, shall we say, preliminary. There is something else to come. Bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put the ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. The robe which would make him fit to sit at his Father's table. The ring which in the East was a symbol and a token and a sign of the authority of a son. And sandals on his feet. Slaves were not permitted to wear sandals, only the son. and the air. What comfort this is to that younger son. Happy are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. What a satisfying of his hunger as his father kills the fatted calf and prepares a feast for his hitherto famished son. Well, this is much, and probably better to think of it as not so much the parable of the prodigal son, but the parable of the Father's heart. Jesus has given us a picture of what God is like as a father. The meek shall eat and be satisfied. And that very nicely leads me in to the next study, God willing. The meek who shall inherit the earth. Now, questions? We're going to have tea and coffee now, so you can bombard me. But I want to see this consistency between the old and the new.
I think he's rightly called the lost son, because in that verse, this my son
Was dead and is lost and found.
is found.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Like the other things that were lost.
That's right. I said the three parables of lost things. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And man can be lost, so man without God is lost. And man without God is dead. Although he's very much alive in the far country, he's actually dead spiritually. Dead in what the New Testament Paul said, dead in trespasses and sins, for you to be forgiven and put aside. And the Father provides that.
The other thing that's quite nice about it is this parable, I think, is it's very kind of human as well, isn't it? The son goes out, I'm going to leave home and I'm going to have some really nice clothes and I'm going to have some real nice flashy jewellery and I'm going to have the best food and I'm going to have the lot, and it all ends sort of disastrously. And what does he get when he comes home? He gets the fatted calf, he gets the best robe, and he gets the father's ring. And it's funny really. You think it's, I mean, it's probably we've all experienced, haven't we? We all think, oh, it's out there, I'm going to kind of get it, but actually you don't actually appreciate what you have got really, and what God can give you.
You see, all man's abilities and gifts, they're God-given, aren't they?
That's right.
But they're exploited and squandered and wasted.
You said about Jesus revealing God, as part of the reason why you gave this particular parable. It seems to me that verse in John chapter 3, verse 16, which emphasizes just how much God does love, like this father in the parable. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Whosoever believeth in him might not perish, but have everlasting life.
One of the key verses there, though, is that 18th verse, isn't it? I will arise and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. I'm no more worthy. That's the humility which you can lead on to.
Just like David after he heard Nathan's parable.
Yeah.
And that's the bit, see, blessed are they that mourn. That is what mourning is in terms of that.
True repentance.
Yeah.
And acknowledgement of sin.
Yeah. So,
I still think it sort of reiterates to me how difficult it is to understand God's word, though, you know what I mean? Because, I mean, if I was that prodigal son, that's precisely what I would try to do with it. Well, you're not actually atoning. You're basically saying to yourself, flipping like I'm stuffed here.
I want
so,
to make it.
What I think what you said is quite right, really. That you don't know what his motive to go back and work as a servant. It's quite simply for his own survival, isn't it?
But you know, the wonder of that is, God doesn't judge our motives
No.
when we turn to him, but he learns, when he sees the mercy of his Father and the love of his Father, his own love grows even more. And John tells us, we love because he first loved us. And it's our response to that love of God that changes us, you see. It's not that we change first, it's God who does it. And it's getting it the right way around like that that's so important. We can't go say, well, you know, here's my penance, I'm doing this, now it quits. It's not, it's you know, it's by love that it might be by grace. We can't earn or work to do it.
Because the other thing as well is, you know, I realise how little I know of the stories in the Bible, if you like, you know, because my take on Jesus is sort of looking after poor, ill people, if you like, you know, making their life better and stuff like that. So then I was thinking, well, in the Old Testament, some of the people are quite rich, aren't they, really? And you think, well, there's a bit of an inconsistency there, because Jesus talked about poor people and the also was all rich people. But here he's rectifying that. This guy, he's a rich guy.
Yeah, that's right. But David was king of Israel. Wasn't he? He had everything under his hand, everything under his control, materially. But remember when we looked at the first one, blessed are the poor in spirit. We said that riches, it's not material. You can be very rich, but not poor in spirit, and very poor and not poor in spirit. It's cultivating the right spirit before God, the right attitude before God, of how you reckon yourself to be in his sight. You see, and so the material element is on the periphery of it, really. It doesn't really come into it.
I mean, it's interesting, what he doesn't say is what the scribes and the Pharisees were saying. I'll go back to my father, because I deserve to be in my father's house, and my father look after me. Yeah? You know, we are Abraham's children, we are heirs of salvation, therefore, you know, the kingdom is ours. That's what the Jews were saying in Jesus' day. And he isn't saying that, and Jesus is teaching that point, that very point, that humility and true forgiveness isn't based upon what we expect. You know, he went back there expecting to be made the lowest servant in his father's house. He didn't expect to have a fatted calf killed or a cooked or whatever.
In connection with what you're saying, we didn't finish this part because there's an elder brother.
A jealous one.
This right son. Now, who is that? Right? Who is the elder brother? Right? He's touched on who the elder brother, the attitude of the elder brother, who was totally out of fellowship with his father's thought. His father wanted to never give me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. You know, so that there is more in the parable, but I didn't pursue that because I wanted to keep it to the.
So I think when you initially read the parable or have it read out, my thoughts are always with the other son immediately. So I'm not focusing on the true meaning.
But
and that always takes you away, really.
When you read it again, make the main emphasis be on the father. So don't think of the parable of the prodigals. The parable of the father's heart revealed. Think of it like that. But I read it again because it's beautiful.
It just shows how
it's
you
such
read
powerful
something,
teaching, isn't it?
How you read it, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
When you don't have the maturity of, you know, with the Bible, you will read it as the father being unfair. Before, that's what I think, and now you see how great is his love.
Well, a lot of people say that, isn't it? You know, well, I want to go and do my own thing. You know, why am I being, restrained and not allowed the freedom I deserve and I want? That's exactly what man is like, what you were saying, isn't it? If you look in the world today, I've turned my back on my God, I've gone my own way, and I make my life for myself. Fatal. It's
And the
very
harsh
true.
reality is they don't come back to God, isn't it?
That's right.
the world in
They
which we
don't.
live. isn't
They
it?
don't come back. They don't say, I have
That's-
sinned and I go back to my
That's the
father.
other dimension.
And it's desperate, isn't it? You see how low he got? But that's another encouraging thing. No matter how low he got, and he got to the lowest point possible, his father welcomed him back. So that means there's hope for you and me.
Yeah.
I think deep down when people do, I had an incident in church again on Sunday night, rattling at the door, so I went to investigate. And there was a man outside, and of course, you know, the parish church is the pub's at the end of the
Oh
village
yes,
gate,
that's
isn't
right.
it?
That's right.
So he popped
Yeah.
in from the pub.
Yeah.
He'd had quite a few to drink, he'd had an awful lot to drink, I think. But he was in such a state, I don't think anything had particularly happened then, but the alcohol probably had brought him to this state where he wanted to come into church. He wanted to come in, fair enough, and all the service was going on, okay, I sat at the back with him. Oh, and he was breaking his heart, and all it was, I feel so, why don't I come here? And I said, you can come here anytime, you can come, you know, whenever. There's 4 services on Sunday and there's on Thursday. And he wanted, why do I feel as I do? And I said, because you're a nice person, isn't it? You know, why do I feel so guilty? He couldn't say what he was feeling guilty about.
No, he had
But
a sense of that his life
sense of
wasn't where it should be.
No, so I think, you know, I don't know whether it's the alcohol that's
Probably
when it's on.
fuels it, doesn't
Yes,
it?
but at
He
least
still had you a
and
measure of...
to the church you don't want to come. You haven't sort of
No.
gone to the bar.
No.
I didn't know when. You know, he